Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Seventh-day Adventist podcast. I'm Ricardo again. Today, I have a very exciting guest. I'm speaking with Pastor David Hamstra. David is the lead pastor. I don't know if he likes the word senior, so I'm going to use lead. He's pretty young.
I think lead is probably more appropriate at this till I get some gray hairs.
Okay, so he's the lead pastor for the Edmonton Central Seventh-day Adventist Church in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And he's also currently doing his PhD at the Andrews University. He also writes beautifully for the Andrews University Theological Seminary on same-sex marriage, politics, and worship. Today we're going to have a conversation that deals with philosophical issues within the church, the body of Christ, theological as well, and just about life existence on a whole. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you for having me.
Beautiful. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. Yeah. It's coming on winter. The sun comes up later, but I did get to see it on the drive in today.
And goes down later, earlier.
Earlier. Yeah.
Like really earlier. I wanted to start with worship, and then I'm going to lay out something for you, and then I'll allow you to take it, and let's see where this goes. I really like the paper that you wrote on worship, and when I was reading the paper, the first thought that came to my mind was most of us don't know why we do what we do. There's an intuitive connection with the experience that we have when we are in church in terms of our worship style. And we don't really investigate, say, why we worship the way we worship, why we sing the songs we sing, why we have the structures within our worship services that we have. Probably those things are probably too complicated. So we don't really look at the ontology of those things. We just deal with the experience. And sometimes the experience is sufficient, and because we feel high in the spirit in the moment. But as I read your paper, I realized that there's a depth to worship experiences that we're unaware of as Seventh-day Adventists, and that it is calling us to, and I think this is really good, to reevaluate in a sense the way we approach worship. Because it seems in your paper that there's a disconnect with our understanding, say, of the heavenly sanctuary and the way we approach our worship system. Can you elaborate on that for us? Can you, on what I just said?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. I mean, first you threw out that, worship is something we inherit, right? We grew up in a tradition, right? And if you grow up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you just sort of take that for granted. If you're baptized into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you might not take it as much for granted if you come from some other tradition of worship, but it is something that we inherit either by birth or by new birth. Let me put it that way. And I think there is some work to be done. I haven't read a history of Adventist worship. I don't think anybody's done that research, right? To find out how has our worship, where did it come from? How has it developed over the 150 plus years, and then where might it be going? So there's a bit of a gap there, even in our own self-understanding of our tradition as Seventh-day Adventists.
And that's interesting. I think that's very, very a very interesting point, because how much of what we do in terms of our worship style in our church is unique to us? And I mean, you made a good point that you don't think anyone has done a work on the history of worship within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But we do have these categorized group that define what worship looks like or should look like based on their probably self-subjective imposed ideologies of what worship is. And you made some really good point in that we are, while, say, for example, let's look at music, which is a good part of worship services. And we're going to look at the structure in a second, and I like the way you laid that out in your suggestions. But let's look at music in a sense. Most of the music that we sing as Seventh-day Adventists is not unique to us.
Yes.
Most of the music we look actually, and as you mentioned in your paper, comes from the background of people that we have really strong theological disagreements with, to be honest.
Yeah. Hopefully more that we agree with than that we disagree with, given that we're singing their music.
Exactly.
or
Exactly.
should we say our music as fellow Christians. But yeah, we do have disagreements as well, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes very strong ones.
Very strong ones, yeah. But still, some of these musics, we sing them in our worship service or worship services, whether it be contemporary music or music like you mentioned, like Faith. I didn't even know Faith of Our Fathers was a Catholic hymn. And I think when I saw that, I begin to see that song in a different light.
Yeah. Well, you don't understand that if you don't understand the history of Roman Catholic disenfranchisement in
Hmm.
the United Kingdom, right?
Okay.
And
Break that down for us.
I believe that Roman Catholics were given the right to vote in the UK in the 1870s, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
Before that, they were forbidden from participating in public life, very much excluded from society in various ways
Hmm.
and considered almost like a fifth column, right? If you understand the history of the Catholic attempts to take back the United Kingdom for Catholicism, right?
Right.
Guy Fawkes and so on and so forth. So this hymn, Faith of Our Fathers, is written by a group that feels marginalized, persecuted, right? Probably in ways more so than Seventh-day Adventists ever have been. Um,
Hmm.
you can talk about times when Adventists were thrown in jail for worship, for not for worshiping on Sabbath, but for working on Sunday, right? But we've never lost the right to vote or anything of that nature. So it is a stirring hymn about maintaining one's faith in a time of persecution,
Hmm.
albeit a faith that we probably, would disagree with them maintaining, would say you probably would be closer to the Bible if you'd move more toward Anglicanism in that environment, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, it's we sing these hymns of faith, even though they might be referring, there's many hymns where the lyrics are talking about meeting Jesus at the end of one's life.
Right.
And when I sing it as an Adventist, I'm thinking of meeting Jesus at his second coming in the resurrection. But it was written by somebody who's thinking that they will meet Jesus when they die, right? And go to
Wow.
heaven at that point, you know?
Can you talk a little more on what you meant by the bodily experience of music versus the mental experience of music?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you had this whole discourse, and I think we're pretty accustomed to having it as Adventists about the words that we are singing, right?
Yes.
And we just had that conversation, and sometimes we'll even adjust the words, right? When I rise, hallelujah, by and by I'll fly away, as opposed to when I
I
die,
die.
hallelujah, by right. So we'll even tweak it a little bit, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true.
But what I want to point out is that what makes sense of words to us is our lived experience, right? Is the
Mm.
way that those words have associated with felt reality,
Hmm.
that the things that we know through our bodies is what makes sense of the things that we know with our minds. And so, in that perspective, we have not really given any attention, as far as I can tell. I could be wrong, right? And maybe someone will point out to me, "Oh, we've attended to this." I would say, "Praise God." But as far as I can tell, in the Adventist Church, we really haven't given any attention to what it is that our bodies are doing in worship and what sort of overall experience we are trying to have in the worship service. And that's the level at which we have also um, adopted, even less reflectively, I would
Right.
say, worship practices from other Christian groups. Most Adventists, as I said, we're lacking this history, right? We haven't even discussed it. But as far as I can tell, our Adventist worship service, the standard one that's in the church manual or whatever, is basically goes back to Charles Finney's sort of revivalism, right? Where the goal is to use the worship practices to
Right.
prepare people to receive a message from the preacher and then to have a response, which is traditionally an altar call.
How is that disconnected from what you pointed out in terms of our belief of the sanctuary message?
Right. Well, what I point out is that, and there's two others that are also on offer to us, the traditional liturgy that goes back to the Catholic Church. I won't even say Roman Catholic because it really goes back to before the Catholic Church had split into Eastern and Western.
Hmm.
And there's also the charismatic worship service that's on offer to us. And you will find very small pockets in Adventism where a traditional liturgy might be had. Typically, they're very progressive churches, interestingly enough, very well educated, very progressive politically, and also liberal theologically. They are more interested in that Catholic service. And the charismatic services coming in more on the bleeding edge of what I would call evangelical Adventism, right?
Hmm.
Where we are trying to look at how can we make the church service more attractive to people.
Right.
And all three of these, what I think they have in common, the Finney altar call, the Roman Catholic liturgy, which comes down on the Eucharist as the focus, and the charismatic service, which has the experience of the worship music being the focus.
Hmm.
What all three of them have in common, I would argue, is that they are bringing God down to earth, and that is where we meet him. Okay.
Interesting.
You meet God at the altar. When you have the altar call, you meet God in the Eucharist when you take the
Mhm.
Lord's Supper, and you meet God when your hands are raised and he inhabits our praise is the Bible verse that's often referenced there, right? So if we have a certain kind of music that produces a certain kind of altered state of consciousness, then we have met God down here. And what I'm pointing out in my article is that according to Adventist theology, we are the reason God comes here is to draw us up there, right?
That's right.
And that the location of his personal presence is in his sanctuary, which is currently in heaven. And that is where we are invited, not only, I would say within our theology to meet God, but I think the scriptures teach us clearly as well, is that we are to meet God in the heavenly sanctuary in our worship.
Which is what we study and believe, especially in our understanding and doctrine of the investigative judgment.
Right. Right. Well, finish your thought, and then I have a riff on that one too.
No, no, I actually go ahead and say that because I wanted to just say probably you could explain to us because we have this idea, and even Ellen White, as you mentioned, where we're moving with God as it were through the sanctuary, and then now you're seeing this gap, this chasm, as it were, between our worship experience and what we actually believe in terms of our relationship with God and where God is. But go ahead and say what you're about to say.
Yeah, well, as I look back on my Adventist experience, and I've been through all different kinds of Adventism, from fairly progressive to extremely conservative,
Hmm.
and I've worshipped in all of these churches, had all these sorts of friends. And there was a time in my high school experience where I studied the academy curriculum from the 70s, the Bible curriculum that high school students went through in the 70s, right? So, I have sort of a sense of where the Adventist Church is at on these things and where it has come from. And again, no one has done this history, so I'm just going off of my experience here. But I think that for most Adventists through the later half of the 20th century, or as my children call it, the late 1900s, right? To the extent that the investigative judgment was an experience, it was an experience of anxiety.
Mm,
Okay. So when you were taught about this, the practical upshot was you don't know when your name is coming up, right? So you better make sure that all your sins are confessed like ASAP,
wow.
because if there's one that's not, you're not going to make it, right?
Mm,
And the idea is as if God is looking for reasons to exclude us from heaven
from
in
heaven.
this in this judgment. And that was done to leverage anxiety into performance, right?
Right.
If people are scared enough of this judgment, but I think it more turns into a generalized sense of anxiety because you don't know exactly what might keep you out, right? So you have to always be on your guard, at that, then people will live the holy life that is necessary for them to live so that Jesus can come back, right? That's sort of the theological package that we got out of the 1920s.
Which was, I think, a very difficult, and I think we could probably talk about that a little bit while we move on in the conversation because, I remember listening to, mostly I would say elders, and not really heard any pastors in my experience either, like that teach this, even though there might be some where they would give the idea that it's almost as if God was playing this game of switching your name. In 1 minute, your name was in the book of life, and what? There's something right there saying you know it's in the book of death. And then, oh, you also forgiveness. Let's transfer that back over there. Okay, so what's going? And and I agree with you when it said that would have given you a level of extreme anxiety that pushes you into this legalistic behavior pattern that literally caused mental health and probably spiritual trauma. At least in me, that's what it did. And I guess what you could do then, if you don't mind me pushing you a little bit on the investigative judgment, is what hope can we have in our investigative judgment, and what is the proper understanding of the investigative judgment? How should we as Adventists view that exactly?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this would take a whole Bible study,
Mm,
but I wrote a paper in seminary based on something I had read uh, about Ellen White in Prophets and Kings, talking about the experience of Joshua the high priest before the angel of the Lord in the vision of Zechariah 3. And I said, well, this would be very interesting if this is the case, because she says this vision has special relevance for the people living in the closing days of humanity's probation, aka the investigative judgment, as it's right. And I said, well, that's nice, Ellen, but is that actually in the Bible? Right. Because
right.
sometimes she's just making her points, right? And that's fine.
Hmm.
We all make our points using various sources, but I wanted to see, is it there? So I wrote a paper on that vision, which I should publish at some point, but it's
Yeah,
just
that'd be nice.
one of these things that I have on the back burner. I have too many projects on the go, and there would need to be some revision to exactly what I argued. But I think the basic argument holds, which is that there are verbal indicators in the text, allusions, if you will, right?
Hmm.
Words that are dropped that are point this vision directly back to the Day of Atonement ceremony. For example, the high priest is before the presence of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is God's proxy presence in the Bible. He shows up when God needs to appear in places that aren't cultically pure, right? Like a worship space, like the sanctuary. And the reason it's not cultically pure is because the high priest is wearing these unclean garments. And
Mm,
in the Day of Atonement ceremony, the cleanness of the high priest's garments was very important. He actually had to change his clothes and wash twice in the course of this ceremony. And
right.
but now he's standing before the Lord with unclean clothes. And the essentially trying to remove iniquity, which is your liability to be punished. And he can't do it because he's bringing iniquity right into the sanctuary,
Right.
because God's heavenly counsel is all there, right? So this is God's throne room where his heavenly counsel is, aka his most holy place. And what happens is God says, well, you can't do it, so I'm going to have to make the atonement. And he says, remove his filthy clothes, put on the clean clothes, right? So you got that change of clothes. And then he says, I've removed your iniquity from you.
Mm,
And that's a technical word, as I said earlier, in the Hebrew Bible for your liability to be punished. And that was only removed on the Day of Atonement, right? So the priest can't remove the iniquity. God has to remove the iniquity. Liability to punishment, if I can explain briefly,
right.
is I like to think about it in terms of the parable of the unforgiving servant. Right. The unforgiving servant owes the great debt to his Lord that he cannot repay. And the Lord says, hey, it's all forgiven. You're free. Then he goes, finds a guy who owes him, $500 and begins to choke him and throws him into prison until he can pay it back, which, if you think about it, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? How's he supposed to get, but, uh, his fellow servants tell the Lord what he's done. And the Lord calls him in and says, in essence, I'm translating here, your iniquity, I'm going to carry out your iniquity now because I forgave you, but you were not forgiving. So you can see that even somebody who's forgiven can still be punished for what they did if they live in an unforgiving manner. All
Mm,
right.
yeah.
You can be forgiven and not experience the consequences of your wrong, which is the debt,
Right.
right? But then that gives you a chance to turn your trajectory of life around. And if
Exactly.
that doesn't, right?
By
It's
being
sort of like
forgiven.
exactly, right? It's there's some times where I have to go to a woman in my church and counsel her to get a divorce. Why? Because
Wow.
she's forgiven this guy dozens of times and he's
Mm-hmm.
still sleeping around,
Mm,
right? The iniquity has to come back in that situation. And
And
so
I think,
this is what sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Finish your thought. I
Well,
just have a question.
Well, I'm going to say this is what God is trying to sort out, I believe, in the investigative judgment. Is
Judgment.
this the sort of person who I can actually bring into heaven and know that they're not going to, and the heavenly council's interested in this as well, right? Are they going to receive this forgiveness and then take advantage of it? Or is the forgiveness actually producing its intended result, which is a transformed life? And so this
I
vision of
love that.
Zechariah 3 concludes with God saying, this has all been a symbol of a day in the future where after my servant the branch comes, and that's Jesus, I
Hmm.
will remove the iniquity of the land, and then everyone will sit under his vine and his fig tree, which is like the new earth, right? So that's how I explained the whole thing in a nutshell.
Hmm.
But there's a crucial point I need to get to, but go ahead and ask your question.
I just really think that that is a really interesting way to look at it. And I'm going to tell you a few things I admired about what you say, and then I'm going to ask you a question. Because when you listen, when the doctrine of the investigative judgment is being taught, and I know we're talking about worship, we're going to eventually get back down to
We'll
that.
get back to it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. So I don't know. Segue is good too. Okay, it's good. So it's interesting to me that in the let's say the apparent investigative judgment in Zechariah that you just outlined, Joshua is standing in a place of condemnation.
Absolutely.
No, that's not the idea that I normally get when I used to listen to the investigative judgment, right? It almost seems like I have to appear in the most holy place, in a place of righteousness, in a place of perfection, in order for me to be accepted. That's the key point. But in Joshua's situation, he was standing in a place of condemnation, and then the righteousness was made for him. And I think that's a very, very powerful framework for us to start thinking about the investigative judgment. It is not about you and I, and this is not, I'm not saying people should live in sin. It's not about you and I coming into this level of perfection, and that would misunderstand that word very much, but perfection, as it were, whatever we mean by that, sinlessness or whatever, I think that's what most people mean when they say perfection, sinlessness, to get into this state of sinlessness so that no God in the judgment can look at me and be like, I don't see any defect, I don't see any blemish. That's an act of work. I did that. God didn't do that for me. But what you just laid out is a total opposite of what I was taught, at least about investigative judgment, is that when I appear in the judgment, I'm actually condemned. When I actually stand in the most holy place, as it were, with God, with Jesus at my side, I'm condemned. But it's Jesus Christ who say, take that garment off. And like you said, he's looking to say, what will this person do with the forgiveness? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
As it was given to him. Can I trust to take this person into heaven? The heavenly council is looking, can this person come into heaven based on the fact that they've been forgiven? Because there's no doubt about the forgiveness. God is forgiving you.
Right.
That's the thing. The
Right.
thing is that is the forgiveness producing fruits of repentance, in that we're literally turning our lives around and we're seeking to do better than what we were when we first met Jesus. And I think Pastor Hamstra, that's a very, and I think this is how we need to teach investigative judgment, because this is one of hope and not one of burden.
Right. Right. Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not one of burden,
Yeah.
but it's one that is calling you into the presence of God, as it were. And God is saying that, well, you appear before me, this is how you look, but this is what I've provided. My son, his blood, his garment is a clean garment. His garment is a righteous garment. And I'm going to put that on you. Now, in light of that, then, and you can make your point while you're thinking about what I'm going to ask. In light of that, because Pastor, I'm being honest with you, man, we're so deep in our tradition that it frightens me to even approach teaching some of these ideas in our churches, because of our, not even our understanding our scriptural tradition, but more just a tradition outside of, say, bits and pieces that we pick up from Ellen White that we think she meant, what we think she meant, that really affects our worldview, where you could be accused of heresy if you make it look like, you know, you don't have to appear perfect in the investigative judgment. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I sort of want to just point out biblically that we can flip the script there, right? And
Mhm.
I think the key point that I need to get to, and it dovetails, I think, very well with what you were saying, is that there is another party in the courtroom, and that is
Mm,
the accuser, right?
mm, mhm.
That's the in Hebrew, the shatan. In English, we say Satan, but in the Hebrew context, shatan is a legal term, right? It is
Mm.
somebody who brings an accusation against someone else in court,
Wow.
right?
Okay.
Yeah, and this is what the shatan is also doing in Job, right?
Right.
He's coming up and saying, "Hey, I got to find somebody to accuse." God's like, "Hey, well, what about?" So in Zechariah, though, he's silent, right? He doesn't say anything, and I think it's because he doesn't have to, right? The guilt of Joshua is manifest, right?
It's obvious.
It's
Yeah.
obvious,
Wow.
and well, there's some more typological stuff there that I don't want to get into. Let's just stay focused here.
Mhm.
The point is that God set up the Hebrew legal system with only two parties in the court. There's the accuser and there is the accused. And the judge starts out on the side of the accused. And then if the accuser can sway the judge to see that the accused is in fact guilty, then the guilty verdict will come down. If not, the innocent goes free. And that is a little different than the way that we think of court, because our system has three parties, right? There's the defense, the prosecution, and the judge. And the
Mhm.
judge is supposed to be unbiased, right?
Mhm.
And gets, but in the Hebrew system, the judge begins with a bias toward the accused. And
Mm.
I think this is a very important thing to understand, is that rather than looking for evidence to exclude us from heaven, God is looking for evidence to keep us in heaven.
Wow.
Okay. Okay.
Wow. It's beautiful.
Right. So it's not like we have to get up to, a 90% or something like that, right? It's like, no, as long as there's evidence that the forgiveness that you've been offered is transforming your life, God will find a way to get you into heaven. And that's he can cover all the rest of that stuff by giving you a new white robe of righteousness, which is where
Mm.
this vision gets into revelation, I think. Yeah.
Love that. I wanted to talk a little more, and then we're gonna move on back to how I'm gonna read something from your paper about, I think, your recommendation of how to construct a worship services. But my heart is being warmed genuinely. And I want you to stick a little bit on that. You said that God is looking, and I want people to pay attention to this. God is looking for a reason to include you,
Exactly.
not one to exclude.
Exactly.
And I know that that might seem like something simple. Oh, yeah, that's true. But in our psyche, Pastor, in our psyche, as Seventh-day Adventist, and I'm speaking specifically to Seventh-day Adventist Christians, in our psyche as Seventh-day Adventist Christians, we don't have that reality.
Right. 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 No.
We do not have that reality in our psyche. Go
Well,
ahead.
yeah, I think, I talked to one woman in my first church, a very sweet old lady, had taught the kindergarten class for many years, but she had some problems in her past, you know.
Mhm.
And I could tell you more stories of this, in my current ministry right now, but I don't feel at liberty to, right?
Right.
So I'm going to
Yeah,
tell
yeah.
you a story from, 20, 25 years ago. And this dear woman said to me that she used to pray, God, I know that you can't save me, but at least save my children, because of this problem in her past. Right. So again, she was laboring under this burden of perfection, right? Like, well, that's it. I'm done. And I think what Adventists have done with that, speaking more of my parents' generation, is to move more toward an evangelical view of assurance of salvation, and, talk about how much the cross, satisfied the requirements of the law for us, right? And all that sort of thing, and talk about the investigative judgment in terms of something God has to do to wrap up the great controversy, even if it gets talked about at all. And then we ignore it because for them it was a source, and probably remains somewhat a source of anxiety. Right.
Mhm.
And so what I want to point out, going back maybe to the worship thing, is the way that our lived experience is always influencing how we make sense of those ideas that we are cogitating about, right?
Right, right.
Our cognition depends on what we've experienced with regard to that thing. And it either opens up or closes down possibilities of interpretation, or really shifts those possibilities from one side to the other. And this, I think we have not understood just how much people's actual lived experience of imagining what's going on in heaven has shaped then where we've come to in the church today, where the investigative judgment is taught for the purposes of evangelism and baptism, and then largely ignored. I would say that's the way it goes in the Adventist Church in North America generally. I know that there are folk coming in from around the world who are still getting that 1970s experience,
Right, right.
as I would, when I went through that. But, this is what's gone on in North America with it, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do with my idea of worship is to say, let's take seriously what we, not what maybe what we do believe, but what we ought to believe biblically about this thing, right? And then see if that can give a different experience than simply one of anxiety.
I think one of the beautiful thing about what you said was, and probably you could just kind of like break down, because I think you were approaching this from the Latin phrase. I think it was lex odani, lex
Lex
credani, and
Orendi.
Orendi, right? Orendi. I'm butchering
Yes.
it right there. I think, was it? So it was lex Orendi, lex
Lex credendi, lex vivendi.
vivendi, right? And it was that, you know, the way we worship, right, regulates our belief, and our beliefs regulates our lives. Yeah, I think you made a good point by saying, if we're not worshiping in light of what we believe, especially in how we understand investigative judgment, then it's almost like there's a gap. There's a gap about what we believe in terms of investigative judgment, and our place in it as to where we should be with God. And the worship experiences that we're having is not communicating that, because we're not being lifted up to heaven in our worship experiences in the most holy place as it were with God, but we're in the sanctuary. And I think you're very right, because in our churches, how many of us, even as ministers, really dig and talk about investigative judgment? There's a detachment there in that it seems like we have this holy grail, as it were, of Adventist theology, very unique to us, as far as I've been able to determine. But it is somewhat on the side burner in our worship and religious experiences.
And therefore on the side burner in our beliefs and in our lives, right?
And our psyche, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you submitted, I'm going to read this and then I'm going to let you comment on it. But in your paper, you said, I submit then 3 broad aims of Adventist worship, or better put, at least 3 things that God enjoys when we worship. And I like that you said that God enjoys, because that's a very good point. That's a very good point. God actually enjoys our worship, right? And he said for us to, one, and this is the first one, be engrossed in the story of God and us. Beautiful. Second, present ourselves with Jesus before God in the heavenly sanctuary by the Spirit sent to be with us on earth, which is what we teach, which is why this is significant. And the final one, you said, offer our lives in service to God and His word, renew our allegiance to Jesus and His kingdom, and surrender to the love of the Holy Spirit in preparation for the second coming. Now, I want you to, this is not what we're doing, by the way, just so anyone is watching. This is not, this is not what's happening.
No, not even in my church, right? I'm just starting to have these conversations with my elders, Ricardo.
Yeah. Yes. And how is that going? And then you can just tell me, how is that conversation going with your elders?
Well, I have to, again, be careful here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because these are live discussions. But, I can say overall very well received. And I think the concern that will come out that I've heard is, well, isn't this Pentecostalism? This is, what some people asked. I mean, as one Adventist minister put it to me, Adventists can get so afraid of the counterfeit that we don't want to get near the real thing.
Oh, I saw that. That's
right.
That is so true.
Yeah. And so I said, no, of course, Pentecostalism is, God comes down here and we have this experience. Again, it's the worry is that we have to have a certain experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Literally, I mean, I could push it even farther, having an altered state of consciousness, right?
Mm.
Um, is what I'm talking about. In the same way that you have when you're watching a really good movie or reading a really good book, you lose track of the ordinary flow of time, right, in your
That's
life.
right.
You're caught up into a different story, engrossed, right, as I put it. And as you go through that, you are even no longer that concerned about yourself, right? You're more concerned about this other story that you're experiencing.
Right.
And we can be afraid of those experiences, I think rightly so, because again, these experiences are shaping what it's possible for us to even make sense of, right?
Mm.
And so if we are having the wrong sorts of experiences, right, we can find ourselves going off track. But what I would want to say, I guess in response is number one, we're trying to have the experience the Bible is telling us to have. And number two, it's not like we can worship without having experiences. Or maybe you can, but that would be very, very boring and,
Very boring. Exactly.
right. It wouldn't, be, it wouldn't sustain you spiritually, right?
Exactly.
You need to have and people will seek out those experiences. So let's talk about it. Let's be intentional about it, right? What is the aim of Adventist worship? What are we trying to do here? We are
Mm-hmm.
trying to produce an experience that God will enjoy us having, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
And one that influences our theology, our belief system, and influence actually our lives. Because I mean, the thing that I saw you pointing out there is that when we have a worship experience, it influences what we believe. So
yes,
probably right now there's a lot of Adventists, and where we're seeing this in some of the more liberal churches, a lot of Adventists who are probably Pentecostal in their heart, but somehow Adventists in other
right.
places because of the worship experience.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Hmm.
And there's so many directions that we could push in this. But
Man, push it.
I want to start off by saying that, I have gone and worshiped with Roman Catholics, right? I have gone
Hmm.
and worshiped with Pentecostals. I have not done certain things that they are doing in their worship,
Right.
because I don't believe as an Adventist that that's right for me to participate in, right?
Hmm.
But I first want to acknowledge that these are fellow Christians and there are
Amen.
things that we can learn from them, right? Number two, I think the place where we are very intentional about this is in our evangelism,
Hmm.
right? In
Hmm.
our evangelism, our evangelistic preachers are not simply relying on, I'm going to go up there and give a good message and then people will, respond and, be totally persuaded by the force of reason in my arguments, right?
Right.
No, they are crafting an experience using things like music and decision cards and all sorts of stuff, right? To put people into a place where they understand that this is not just something where you can say, "Oh, that was interesting," and walk away and live your life as it was before, right? I mean,
Right.
I've sent out so many Bible studies through the mail that
Hmm.
people have gone through and I go to visit them and they're like, "Well, it was interesting, but," because they got the information without the experience, right?
Mm.
And one thing that a missions professor told me that I will never forget is there are two ways to change people's minds. You can give them a new explanation and you can give them a new experience. And the new explanation is almost never going to do it. But if you can combine an experience with an explanation, that's powerful. Okay.
Yes.
So we understand this in evangelism, we understand this in missions, but then we think once somebody gets into the church, then that whole script gets flipped, right? All of a sudden they lose their body and just become a mind or whatever, right? And we just have to dump the right information in, right? And what we're functionally doing is denying our doctrine of the whole human being,
Exactly.
right?
Because because as you state, seems fundamentally in a worship experience is focused on the mental rather than the whole holistic experience for the human being. That's the reason why, as we just mentioned earlier in the podcast, that we would alter songs. I remember I used to sing in Jamaica, back in Jamaica, in this a cappella group, and we had this
Nice.
one experience where we had this song on, this song on the resurrection morning, on the resurrection morning, when all the dead in Christ shall rise. And well, no, I think that was the wrong song. It was,
On the bright and cloudless when the roll is called up yonder, is that
I
what
think
you
it was the I want to go to heaven. Roll Jordan.
Nice, okay.
I want to go to heaven when I die. And it was really interesting because you mentioned that there's the music around that
Mhm.
that influences the song,
Right.
but somehow we strip the song of the music and we put it down to the lyrics, because if the lyrics is fine, then we can accept it.
We can accept it.
And it goes back to that because we're dealing with the mental aspect of worship. And I remember the bass guy was singing that part, roll, well, roll, Jordan, roll, roll. And it was so, it's fun because people like the bass more in the song. And then I remember we sang that part where it said, I want to go to heaven when I die. We went down to this deep note, like close to an E1. And after the song, I remember, I will never forget this. There was a certain pastor, he got up in the church and was like, powerful bass, but we need to fix it. And what he needed to fix was the fact that we said, I want to go to heaven when I die.
Yeah. Yeah, you gotta put rise in there.
Rise. And
That's the
exactly,
Adventist
that's what happened.
substitution.
And then every time when we sing that song, is I want to go to heaven when I rise.
There you
And I remember
go.
we'd go to even some Sunday churches and we'd sing, and they'd be like, what are you guys talking about? That's not the song. But the point I'm making, just to come back to what I'm saying, is it seems to me like there is a holistic experience that we need to have as just as human beings in our worship experiences with God. But what has led us, Pastor, to focus so much on the mental aspect of worship rather than the whole experience? What caused that?
Yeah, well, it's our culture. I think the inheritance of like Western philosophy, right, if I could put it that way, right? Where the mental has always, I mean, we could push it all the way back to Parmenides, but the idea is that your mind is this unchanging soul from the timeless realm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that allows you to connect in with what's really real, right? And everything that's changeable down here on earth is just the shadows on the wall, to use Plato's cave analogy, right? And then with Immanuel Kant, that whole timeless framework gets actually put into your mind. So instead of the transcendence, you have the transcendentals for
Mm-hmm.
Kant, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's our modern Enlightenment heritage. But it's the same idea that there are these timeless structures that you need to connect with, and for Kant, God has to be beyond even that, right?
Right.
And so this idea is that we connect with God, and I think this is the other idea that pulses through all three of these things: the revival, the Catholic, the charismatic, is that we connect with God in some way outside of time. Okay. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what's really real. And
Mm-hmm.
and the mind is about as close as you can get to that, but even the mind isn't good enough. You have to have some out of time experience. And so
That's true.
with the Catholic one, that's the Eucharist, right? Like literally the bread is in time, and so it doesn't matter, right? It has to get this outside of time Christ dropped into it, and now you're connecting with, and so you have this music that is meant to transport you into a feeling of, suspension. Again, altered states of consciousness are always involved in worship,
Mm-hmm.
but this one is telling you you need to lose your sense of time in order to connect with God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the same thing is going on in the charismatic worship service,
The
using
music.
music, right? Which we know can be a psychotechnology that can induce altered states of consciousness. I'm not saying that you hear charismatic worship music and all of a sudden you're hypnotized, as some people say. But if you want to use it to go there, you can use it to go there, right? And this is common across many cultures, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
simply going on in charismatic worship or Pentecostal worship. The whirling dervishes or whatever are using that spinning to get the same effect in their mind. But that's why if you ever get a chance to go to a Pentecostal church on a Sunday night, don't go on
Mm-hmm.
Sunday morning. That's for the normies. Go on Sunday night where they do their prayer service, right? And that's where they'll repeat the bridge over and over and over and and it's when you allow your mind to go into that repetition, you
Mm-hmm.
lose that sense of yourself and the passage of time,
Mm-hmm.
and and that's your connection with God, because God is, and this is reinforcing a notion, right, that God is
Mm-hmm.
outside of time. And I think a similar thing, although there's different ways of experiencing this, obviously, can happen in the revival service, where in much Protestant theology, the cross is where the outside of time comes into time.
Right.
And that's what you're invited to at an altar call, literally, right? That's
Yes.
that's the cross where Christ's sacrifice was made. So that's where you connect, and people seek that experience over and over again. I want to come forward again, right? Because that's where
Right.
I'm going to meet God.
Exactly.
And it's this place where eternity dropped into time. And so it's what's really real. And regardless of whatever else is going on in time, I go there to meet with that. And of course, the challenge with this for Seventh-day Adventists is that if what's really real is outside of time, then a heavenly fulfillment of a time prophecy doesn't make any sense, right?
Mm.
A two-phase ministry of Christ doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Interesting.
So again, we come down to something which is turning our attention toward earth, and also saying that God isn't really, I wouldn't say he's with us in our time. I would say we're with him in his time, right? That's where we
Right.
need to go, right? Um, and I think we need to, in our worship services, do a much better job of actually telling a story, right? Because stories are how we make sense of time. And begin maybe with creation and with the hope of the second coming. I think the cross fits in very well with the sermon,
Mm-hmm.
because all sermons, I think, ought to take us to the cross. And I think prayer would probably be the best fit for where we meet with God in the heavenly sanctuary. But
Mm-hmm.
what I'm describing is a worship service that I think draws us into God's story and gives us an experience ultimately at the climax of the service of being accepted in heaven, rather than having to be anxious about our acceptance in heaven, and then can have a hope of transforming us, because all of these experiences, let's not forget, are shaping the whole framework out of which we're interpreting not just our theology or whatever, but interpreting life, right? So this experience needs to be one that ultimately shapes who we are and how we live.
Well said. Well said. Now, I know that we could really, really, really exhaust this topic if we go on, but I also want to be respectful of your time as well. But I want to move on to a next topic that
Sure.
is somewhat taboo. Probably afraid to talk about. And I actually love the way you approach it, same-sex marriage in debating the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I was reading your paper because even myself, being I haven't debated publicly or expressed any public opinion, but you made a very interesting observation that the conversation has more to do that with our understanding, and you're joining this philosopher Charles Taylor of imminence and transcendence in terms of how the world functions, like transcendent with what is outside of the world, in terms of structure, belief, morals, imminence in terms of what we have in the world, like our laws and stuff like that. And you made, and I want you just to break down for us how are we approaching the debate, and how do imminence and transcendent good show up or shows up in the church today?
They show up everywhere.
Mm,
And in fact, what we've just been talking about is what I believe is a transcendent good.
I like that too. That's right.
Yeah. But let's start by just defining imminence and transcendence. So imminence refers to that which is immediate, right?
Right.
And this is immanence, not imminence. Imminent means it's going to happen soon, like immediate in time.
Hmm.
Immanence means it's immediately present to us in any sort of way.
Right.
Okay.
Is it
And
the same thing that Nietzsche talked about when he rejected all the metaphysical frameworks for how we view existence? Is the same thing transcendence, and he's saying we should look at it in the light of imminence?
absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
interesting.
yes.
Go ahead.
Very, I think he may have been the first to put this into, because imminence originally referred to the Trinity. The
Mm-hmm.
relationship that the members of the Trinity have with one another was called the imminent Trinity. Okay. So
Mm.
I think he may have been the first to apply it in this way.
That's true. I think so too. Yeah.
But this is coming more directly from the philosophy of Karl Jaspers,
Mm-hmm.
spelled with a J, like the park, not too far from us in Edmonton. Karl Jaspers, German Jaspers. Yeah. 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 Well, I mean, say it how you will.
I know.
But we don't want to be too hoity-toity here. So yeah, we can call
Yeah.
him
Yeah.
Karl Jaspers for this purpose.
Mm-hmm.
What he noted was that there was a time in human history where most human beings believed that everything that was good for you was good for you in terms of this life, right?
Right.
And that the job of your relationship with the gods, and there are multiple gods in this time of history,
Mm-hmm.
is to provide you with those good things. And it's sort of a quid pro quo, right? Well, the gods like sacrifices. Okay, I'll sacrifice to the gods, and then they'll provide me with fertility, success in war, whatever it may be that I need, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what he noted was that at about the same time, and this is a bit of a controversial theory, but I'm just giving you Jaspers's version of it, okay? It's called the
Okay.
axial age. Was that there came to be a time when there were major world religions that were founded in different parts of the world where people says that actually there's something good for human beings that goes beyond the here and now, right? There's
Hmm.
something more to live for than just what's good for us in this life. And he noted that in India, in Southwest Asia, the great world religions are offering you more to life.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you get out of that? Right? Maybe you think it's just a con job. Like, these religious guys are saying, give us all your money, right? Because there's more to life. Why would people fall for that? Right? Why would they be so dumb? Well, what you're getting out of that is a more meaningful life.
Mm.
Because if your life can only matter in terms of your retirement fund and having some great experiences at concerts or whatever it may be, right, eventually, like Kierkegaard pointed out, you're going to exhaust all of that, right? Even duty at some point is going to become like, well, I've done my duty, now what, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
And and you're going to maybe isn't there more to life, right? Because human beings not only need to, because we have this ability not just to want things, but to want things, right? We have this we have this burden of self-consciousness,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like,
We're conscious of self-consciousness.
right? Like a
Yeah.
dog isn't like, maybe I should aspire to more in life. He's just happy, right? If you give him
Yeah.
his food and give him his love, right?
Yeah.
Human
Yeah.
beings have this need because meaning is how things can be about something else, right?
Exactly.
And in this case, it really refers to how do things refer to what matters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we can have these desires about our desires. We can say, "I want my life to matter for more," right? And people need that sense of a fullness of meaning, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
have all of your material needs, even social needs, whatever met, but if you don't feel like your life ultimately matters for something, then you can often go off on very strange directions, right? And
Exactly.
we've seen this in Europe where, a lot of the extremist Muslim terrorists have been very well paid professionals. Why are you throwing away this career as a doctor, right? With all the comforts that go along with it in order to
Wow.
conduct a suicide bombing, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
because the life that they were living didn't afford them enough meaning and they went looking for it in what I believe is the wrong place. Okay.
Yes. In what
Right.
probably I would say Nietzsche recommend,
Right.
because
Well,
that's where he recommends that you look.
self-assertion, the will to
Ex-
power, right? Well,
exactly.
I don't think Nietzsche would condone suicide bombing as a way to,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
but some of his followers may be getting there.
Exactly. Because he completely demolishes the metaphysics. Like
Mhm.
he completely cut them out as somewhat, and it's really hard because he contradicts himself a lot. So I don't even know exactly what to make of his arguments sometimes, but because there are times when he would like, yeah, these transcendents are pointless.
Right,
They're pointless.
right.
But God is dead and we kill him and we're gonna suffer the consequences. I'm like,
Yeah,
But
Yeah.
like how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I think what Nietzsche meant by that, and this is interesting that we're going to Nietzsche, but
I know, right?
I think what Nietzsche meant by that is now we have to define that whole frame against which things matter.
That's right.
And that's what we've been talking about with worship, right? What
I
does this
agree.
worship experience do? It recalibrates what Charles Taylor calls your background.
Mm,
And I like to think, to understand background, we can use the visual, right? Like right now, I've put myself against a very specific background, right? In my office,
hmm
right? I want you to see all the books that people always ask me, have you read all of those? Right? And I was like, no, I haven't. Right. But they're there if I want to read them. Right? No, but
Exactly.
I have read many of them, but it shows you that I'm somebody, right? If I were to
hmm
put myself against, the background of my living room, you might say, well, this guy's to be taken seriously because his living room's a mess. You know what I mean? In other words, the background makes sense of the foreground, right?
mm,
The background makes sense of the foreground, and our background preconceptions, and we're going to call them preconceptions because they are these things that we know as a result of our lived experience, but cannot entirely articulate, right?
right.
Because the
Right.
minute we go to articulate them, they come into the foreground, and then
hmm
we need other stuff in the background to make sense of them.
That's right.
So think of it in terms of these. There used to be these funny web pages on the internet in the early days of the Web 1.0, where
hmm
it was sort of like a BuzzFeed thing, where the photograph would be zoomed up on something, right? And it
hmm
would say, "What is this?" Right? Take
hmm
a picture of a frog and zoom up closely on its skin, right?
hmm
Without
hmm
the background, you have no idea what you're looking at,
That's
right?
right. That's
So
true.
we need the background to make sense of the foreground at all times. And what Nietzsche is saying is that we just lost our background because God was what everything that was good ultimately made sense in
Built
terms of.
on.
And we are living our lives, our day-to-day lives, as if he does not exist. Right? We're just going, and this is what Taylor points out about modern society, is that everything you have to do to survive in a country like Canada,
hmm
again, think of it in terms of worship, but what we go through on a day by day basis,
hmm
right? And another interpreter of Charles Taylor, James K. Smith, who's from Canada, has
hmm
this. Both of these guys are Canadians, actually. Taylor is from
It's
Quebec, and
Canadian.
yes, Taylor's is Canadian. So James K. Smith talks about this liturgy of going into the mall, right?
hmm hmm
You have it's like a secular cathedral. You have this high sweeping ceiling, right? And you go in, and there's certain things that you have to go through, certain things that have to be exchanged and whatnot. Very much like a Roman Catholic liturgy, but it's all reinforcing the notion that everything that matters is the here and now, right?
Right.
Like when I wake up in the morning, what do? Right? I check my smartphone to see how the weather is, right? It
The
tells me the
time.
time. Already the time is chopped up into equal chunks so that I can fill them with the meaning that I have for them, right? Right? The time is divided up this way so that I can assign it the meaning that I need to assign. So I got to be to work at this particular time, right? Why? So I can make the money. And already the money has detached value from God, right? Just as our clocks have detached time from God, the value of the money is whatever someone's willing to pay for it, right? Same of
Exactly.
my labor, everything else, right? So there's all of these very fundamental things. I just talk about it in terms of time and money. We could talk about much more that we go
Right.
through in life that are saying everything that matters is here and now. Everything that matters is here and now. And Nietzsche is simply pointing that out. That's what
Exactly.
his prophet is doing. He's saying
That's
we've
right.
erased the horizon, right?
I know we're just focusing on the now and I'm happy
You
that you
claim God exists. You have this belief, but your background is doing something totally different. The same
totally
argument that
different.
I made about worship just before.
And it's really funny because I think, I guess one of the point, and Jordan Peterson also alluded to this in the sense that, like, you don't know what you mean when you say you believe. Because if you actually know what you do, then it's literally gonna pull you out of the imminence. Your action is gonna because for him, belief is more acting out than saying out. And I don't want to get too much into Jordan Peterson, but I'm happy that you painted it out, because in your article, that's the way you are seeing that people are approaching, for example, the conversation of same-sex marriage, where it is not reasoned from a perspective that probably two men or two women shouldn't get married because of this transcendent value, right? But rather it is more of, okay, what is legal, what is ethical, and what is not. And we also fall into this aspect of as Adventists, I'm speaking, we fall into this aspect of reasoning too, where it's not, and I think you're right when you say it's not so much about interpretation of the scripture to understand if these behaviors or these systems are acceptable. In this case, same-sex marriage, but it's what framework are we using to make the argument? Is it
Absolutely.
one that is in touch with our own reality or imminence as a sense, or is it one that's from transcendent? And what I want you to answer for me is what dangers arise when one side of the conversation dominates the other? Because I think you're given the intuition that probably we should have both sides of the conversation. But what happens when one side dominates? Why is that dangerous?
Yeah. Well, I think to answer that, I have to establish one other thing that I think it's in the maybe even in the background of what Taylor's doing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this idea that you can't have all the goods at once. And this is what he does in his book on called Sources of the Self, right?
Wow.
He's basically argues that what it means to be a person is to be able to say, this is better for me than that. And so I'm going to give up this thing that would otherwise be good for me in order to pursue this thing that I believe. Note the word believe, right? Because you can't know in advance. You're making what he calls a strong evaluation. It's an evaluative judgment. You know, you're taking a bet, as it were, right? That this is actually going to turn out to be better for me than these other things. And people who can't do that, basically they're on the street, right? They're chasing
Yes.
whatever immediate pleasure they can find.
That's true. That's true.
And the people that we admire, the persons we most admire, are those who are able to do that and for whom that bet is paid off, right? So I don't know, Ricardo, what do you like? You know, what's a cultural touchstone for you? Are you into cricket? I mean, what's your...
Yes, cricket is one of my things. I like cricket.
Okay, who's your favorite bowler?
Mervyn Dillon.
Mervyn Dillon.
It's the whole guy right back there. Yeah, Mervyn Dillon. Yeah.
I have no idea who Mervyn Dillon is, but I can bet that Mervyn Dillon probably could have enjoyed a very relaxing life if he'd wanted to, right? He probably could have hung out on the beach, right? Worked just enough to pay the bills and just really had a really chill life where he had a lot of fun times with friends and, that sort of thing, right? We would say this is not a bad life, right? A good life. But instead of doing that, he decided to spend a ton of time on the cricket hole, right? Practicing his bowling. I almost said pitch because I'm American, but he's bowling. Bowling is done with a straight arm, right?
Yeah.
And so and he learned all those subtleties, all those nuances, right? He made an evaluation that although I could have done all these other things and had a different life and it would have been a good life, I pursued this to the max and I gave up other things that would otherwise be good for me in order to become the best cricket bowler that I could be, right? So in other words, we're all doing this, right? And the people we admire are able to do it very well.
Right.
And the question for Charles Taylor is, are you able to do that with reference to transcendent goods? Right? Because in this new pagan age, we're living in a kind of a new pagan age where we've gotten rid of the gods, right? But we still we have the imminence, right?
Yeah.
Everything that matters is in the here and now.
I probably reduce them. Reduce them to the imminence.
Right. We reduce them, right? So we have, we can make sense of a cricket bowler giving up all this, he could have had more time with his mom. He could have had more, all these other good things he gave up in order to be a great cricket bowler. We can say, yeah, that makes sense because I can make sense of it in terms of something within the here and now, right? That fits within my frame, within my background, right?
Right.
But what people struggle to make sense of is someone who says, I'm going to give up this thing that otherwise would be good for me for something that's beyond the here and now, right? Because God said to keep this day holy, therefore I'm going to give up my job, right? And Taylor says that's like telling somebody I cut off my arm because it wasn't good for me, right? It comes across as a mutilation to somebody within the imminent frame, right? And so that's why you get all these arguments within Adventism that refer to, is it good for us in the here and now? Because that's where we most easily make sense of things. That's the rhythm of our life that we
This
go through.
exactly.
Unless we're inserting a different rhythm, which is why Sabbath, for example, is so important, right? Sabbath
Hmm.
says that this clock is not actually what's important about time, right?
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
on a lower level. What's really
Right.
important about time is when the sun that God made rises and sets, and once every 7 of those cycles, we have to not do things that would otherwise be good for us in order to be in his presence, which is what's ultimately the greatest good, right?
Greatest good.
And so what my argument about worship is well, when we're in that time for God's presence, where do we go in space to be in God's presence? We go to the heavenly sanctuary.
That's right.
Right. So we have to have, if you, in order to hold transcendent goods, you have to be willing to give up other things that are less good in order to have them. And we call that a sacrifice.
That's right.
Okay.
And Jordan Peterson talks extensively about denying the now and then for the better you in the future. Which mean, I got up this morning, I could probably sleep in bed a little later because I feel like, I want to do it. But I purposefully got up early, I'd worship with my family, get this podcast done because there's something that is, say, transcendent than are better that I'm aiming to be, right? Or this morning I get up and I don't want to really study today. I'm feeling tired. Whatever it is, fatigue. But nevertheless, I could make a decision because it probably it would probably be a good thing to rest because rest is not a bad thing. But I'm going to actually give up that for the moment. These immediate gratification or these immediate good, because there's something about, say, myself as a pastor that I'm trying to gain. There's a level of probably intellectual stimulation that I'm trying to reach, effectiveness in my ministry that is requiring of me right now to sacrifice right now for the longer term.
Yeah,
Now,
exactly.
Friedrich Nietzsche would say it's weakness because in his mind, like we have made up all these um virtue to cover for our weaknesses. We make up forgiveness because we ourselves don't have the power to gain the stuff that we want. So we look at the power hungry as evil. And then to comfort our own insecurity, our own weakness, we say, well, we forgive them. Or we're more meek, or we're more humble. And I know I'm trying to push this idea of the transcendent in terms or in the light of same-sex marriage. Now, as far as my understanding goes, the Adventist Church as a whole, their statement on that is that, that's not something that the church affirms. Am I right about that?
Of course. Yeah.
Right, right. But nevertheless, the debate, because, the church make a statement, but then within the realms of Adventism itself, there is the debate about how should we approach this.
And that's how you know the Adventist Church isn't a cult, right?
Boom! I'm happy you said that. Boom, boom. And I hope that the people who are watching this are on Adventist, we can see, because a lot of time, and we can probably touch into that, most of the videos, is the Adventist Church a cult, blah, 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 blah. That's so you know, because the Adventist Church is so diverse that there are people within the realms of Adventism who holds to the fact that no, because of the fact of freedom of conscience, because of the fact of freedom, these people should be allowed to marry.
Yeah. Because
Do you
of
know
all
what I
the
mean?
imminent goods that it
Because of all
provides.
the imminence good.
And what I pointed in my article is that it's actually a very conservative argument as well, right?
Mhm.
It's an argument for stabilizing relationships. And actually the progressive, LGBTQ crowd or whatever, when same-sex marriage came in, they were not happy with that, right? They
That's
wanted
right.
they wanted sexual liberation to get rid of marriage altogether and, be much more free-flowing with relationships,
That's right.
right? So you have all of these, I'm not saying it's decisive because nothing in the imminent frame is actually ever decisive. You can always argue another side. We could bring in the people who argued against Nietzsche out of the imminent
Exactly.
frame as well, right? Only when you have transcendent goods do you come down and say, well, here's something that we just will not do no matter what.
Right, right.
I think I've introduced the notion of sacrifice, right? Which, you can, of course, make sacrifices for imminent goods as well. People talk in the language of sacrifice for that, but it becomes much more difficult to make sense of um, uh, when out of the imminent frame when you're making a sacrifice for transcendent goods. And then the question is, well, how do I know, which sacrifices I'm supposed to make, right? Because one thing that I didn't address in this article is that there is a culty side to Adventism where they ask you to make ever increasing sacrifices and what you're getting out of that is a more and more sense of meaning. And so you go on what I call a meaning binge, right? Just as an alcoholic or a drug addict can go on a binge where they're getting ever more and more euphoria out of, until it either kills them or, they quit, right? There are organizations within any transcendent religion will have a wing, ascetic wing, we can call it that, right? Because you might wonder, what are these ascetics getting out of starving themselves and doing all these, well, because they are getting that fuller sense of meaning, right? And they're not content with the meaning that they're being offered, right? They want more, right? So I have to give up more, and then I find more meaning, right? So I'm not saying that there's no dangers on the other side here, right?
Right.
There
Right.
certainly are. And I think what the secret sauce of Adventism is in a way is it has that sense of these are the things that you give up for God, and you get meaning out of that, fuller meaning. But there are also things that God expects you to enjoy and to do to
Right.
live a full life in this world. And we might call that our message of, a health message, education, and all of these sorts of things that are also emphasized. And I think what unites both of those together is our vision of Eden lost and Eden restored. And I have this long footnote in that paper where I argue that the reason that Adventists adopted the Sabbath in the first place is because they were looking forward to Eden restored. And so there was a very narrow window where the Seventh-day Baptists decided to go out and tell other Christians about the Sabbath. And the only ones who were receptive to that were the people who were still looking forward to the soon return of Eden after the great disappointment, right? So if you want to ask, why do Seventh-day Adventists sacrifice for the Sabbath? It's because it comes out of Eden, and we expect it to be in Eden restored. Why are Seventh-day Adventists promoting vegetarianism as a healthy lifestyle and, living all these long years, the imminent good side of it? Well, it's because it comes out of Eden, right?
Mm.
That's sort of what's uniting the vision here.
Want to push a little bit on the political front, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, didn't get to read your full article that you did on, I think it was Judgment and
The judgments of God. Oh,
Judgments of God.
that's how much time do you have, Ricardo?
I know, right? I realize that we're out of time, we're
No,
gonna wrap up soon.
I'm literally on sabbatical. I can
Yeah.
stay here all day.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Good.
yeah,
Good. We might have to turn this into a part one and part two. But I find and I realize that our conversation now is connected from the worship to our understanding of transcendent good and imminent good
mhm,
and stuff like it's all connected. So
yeah.
I really what I want to bring out though, and your article is kind of like the backdrop for this, but I want to start with the Charlie Kirk assassination and then move her way through the political climate in terms of Christian nationalism and stuff like that. Now, like you and I, like me, sorry, and we both saw that very tragic incident where, man, it was really sad and very hard to watch, where Charlie Kirk was shot and he died. Like when I saw it, I'm like, "Whew, this." When I saw it first, when I got a glimpse on Instagram, and they were like saying, "Praying for pray for Charlie, pray for Charlie," and I saw it in my spirit, I'm like, "How is he gonna like recover from that?" Because when he got hit, the gushed blood, like you saw the graphics yourself. It has given reason to a bunch of different things that a lot of people are trying to make sense of. And I don't know how many of us talk about it or address it as Adventists from our pulpit, but our members are talking about it or young people are talking about it. Like everyone is talking about it. And one of the way that we're seeing is that for me, Pastor, I've never seen people in the United States government, and more specifically speaking about the Republican Party, affirm or talk about the name of Jesus so publicly. Like I've never seen that before. Like I've seen people hinted in their speech. Like
Yeah,
I'm talking about the politicians now.
yeah,
Hinted in their speech of, we're a Christian nation, blah blah. Trump is a little more out there when it comes to that. But almost everyone that went on that stage, if it was a Charlie Kirk memorial, were professing and were claiming and attaching themselves to Christians and to Jesus Christ after the wake of Charlie Kirk. And it has sparked a lot of debates. Some of them that, are going into whether some of them are very radical, and some of them I thought were unnecessary too early to be getting to at the point when a family, a wife, and kids are grieving. What I want to bring up from this is, what do you make of this whole thing? And is there a fake revival that is happening in the Western civilization because of this, or is it real? What's your take on what's happening with that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think Charlie Kirk's assassination even goes back to the stuff that we were talking about with Charles Taylor.
Right.
Interesting that we have two Charleses here, right? But there's another interpreter of Taylor, Andrew Root, who pointed out on his podcast called Ministry in a Secular Age, I think is his podcast,
Hmm.
which people should listen to after they listen to your podcast.
Yes,
Um,
please.
that, Charles Taylor basically sketches out those three options for people in a secular age, three, major, options. Actually, there's a fourth, but there's three major ones. One, we've already talked about, Nietzsche, right?
Right.
And we've talked about sort of the transcendent approach, right? But there's another imminent approach, which is what he calls exclusive humanism, right?
Hmm.
And exclusive humanism is this idea that human beings are all that matter and that every human being matters equally, right?
Mm.
And that's not really true for Nietzsche, right? For
Right.
Nietzsche, the excellent matter, right?
Exactly.
Mattering is something that you have to strive for, right?
The Superman. Yeah.
Yeah. The Uberman is somebody who has sufficiently strived in order to establish their own terms of morality, right?
Right.
Um, and that's, but for the exclusive humanist, morality is a given, which is that you could literally call it, and I don't want to, be too tongue in cheek as I say this, right? But you could literally call exclusive humanism all lives matter, right? That's
Um,
that's
that's a good
exclusive
point.
humanism.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But really, the way it cashes out then is in terms of Black Lives Matter, because what we have to do for all lives to matter is to lift up the lowest, right? And
Hmm.
so exclusive humanism is that, it, how can we call it, that egalitarian, liberal, modern, right? Trying to get to Denmark, Francis Fukuyama, end of history sort of approach to life, right? And the meaning of
Hmm.
life, it sustains that. And Charlie Kirk, and it's not that people are exclusively one of these three things, right?
Right.
They can be
Mixtures of this. Right.
right. And there's another option as well, which is Camus, right? Which is to take up this rebellion against the absurdity of life, right? That's a whole other approach that you can, but let's talk about those two,
Hmm.
because they seem to be what's fighting right now in American politics, or even Western politics, a kind of a Nietzschean striving for meaning, right? Where we have to assert ourselves, versus the exclusive humanist, where we all have to strive collectively together for the, sort of universal good of
Good.
humanity, right?
Right.
The Nietzschean view is very much from the inside out. The universal view is so that the exclusive humanist has to, abstract yourself from it loves humanity in the abstract. Let me put it that way, right?
Right.
Where you sort of imagine a God's eye view of, and then what should I do that's right? Effective altruists are like this or whatever, Um, and what Root points out is that we have all of these types of people in our churches, right? And what seems to be challenging about the Charlie Kirk assassination is that he was very much trying to point toward a transcendent good.
Hmm.
And, like me, trying to say that sexual ethics matter for that, right?
Right.
That there's transcendent meaning to our sexuality that's worth sacrificing for, right?
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
people like me get pretty excited about that, right?
Hmm.
But he also had this more Nietzschean side to him, right? Where he would go on a podcast and, try to assert things for the betterment of, this is a big question. Is Charlie Kirk a racist? Maybe. I know he said some racist things, right? Maybe he was just processing his feelings out loud when he shouldn't have been, right? I know that he also tried to help minority people in various situations as well. So I don't think
That's
he's
right.
like a classical racist where like a true racist wouldn't even come on this podcast. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Right. But
Exactly. Exactly.
he wasn't that sort of racist, but
And
he,
I think that's hard to define too, because,
yeah.
and sorry to interject, but
No, go ahead.
it's because we have thrown the word racist around so much. It's really lost its meaning, and you can't make any constructive criticism of, say, a minority group,
Mercy.
especially if you're somebody like Charlie Kirk,
Yeah.
without being labeled as a racist. And I mean, I watched some of those stuff that they said he said, and I know that most of the people who watched them, they watched them out of context. They didn't really watch the full essence of, the delineation of things that he was saying that led up to that one thing, which make more sense. But it's the era of technology where you can just use one clip and say, okay, this is the person's whole worldview.
Well, on the other hand, though, he leveraged those little clips to, I
True.
encountered
It's a
Charlie
good
Kirk,
point.
short clips of him, owning somebody on the left, right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
look,
Continue.
I felt like some of the stuff that he said was unnecessarily, race baiting, if I can call it that, and out of
Mm-hmm.
line.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, but overall, I would want to say he had that more Nietzschean side to him, right?
Right.
Which I think comes up against the claims of Christ, right? In the same way that exclusive humanism comes up against the claims of
Disclaimer.
Christ as well. But what we have is what scrambles those categories is he definitely had one foot in both sides, right?
Right.
He had his Sabbath keeping, right? His transcendent Sabbath keeping. He also
Mm-hmm.
had his, Nietzschean approach to politics and society where, well, if the poor, deserve it, well, the immigrants, whatever, there's, and I don't mean to say that those are simple issues, right? I'm just trying to say that there has to be a way of approaching those issues out of our transcendent commitments, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we could have some debates and discussions about that. And I would want to think that Christians could celebrate
Mm-hmm.
the fact that, people are considering Jesus, right? And
I
turning to
agree.
him as a result of this, Christians such as myself who didn't, had problems with some stuff that Charlie Kirk said or didn't appreciate all of his politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I think we need to have an answer for the young people in our world who feel that they need more meaning in life than what exclusive humanism is offering, right? And are being attracted to the Nietzschean side
Mm-hmm.
beyond just, simply moralizing at them, right? And to be able to say, actually, there is something that you can strive for, it's
Mm-hmm.
godliness. And it is where you can realize all of your highest ambitions, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
If not in this world, then in the next, right? And that there's a place for that sort of drive and ambition within the kingdom of God, right? So I would like to think that we could have an answer to both of those things, and then also maybe to have some conversations even within the church about how are we going to handle some of these contentious issues around race and ethnicity and even within our
Politics.
own doors, right? Even within the house of God, we have challenges. Yeah.
We have this very passive approach to political ideologies within the Adventist Church.
Hmm.
I don't know if we're scared to um, engage it. I don't know what the stories around that exactly. I probably need to study that some more. But what do you make of that? And even as Adventist ministers, how involved, I guess, because one of the problem I'm finding, David, is even within my church, there are other people who are asking questions, and they're almost always intertwined with politics. They're almost always, some of them are, and they're hinging on the theological, but they're also within the political realm too. They're intertwined. And I would say, especially because of the Charlie Kirk situation, like, and especially amongst young people who were deeply influenced by Charlie Kirk from both sides of the spectrum. And my thing is because of our passive approach to politics within our church, some of us are very limited because we're probably of our own ignorance. We're ignorant in political issues and what's happening, so we don't really even really know how to answer those questions. And as a consequence, our youth are getting answers from different, say, pastors and different platforms. Not that that is entirely wrong, but we want to teach our young people because of what we believe as Seventh-day Adventists. But what do you make of that, and how do you think, even as Adventist ministers, we can equip ourselves to face and answer these questions and challenges?
That's a really good question. I think the political history of the Adventist Church is better studied than our worship history. So we certainly have some.
Wow.
We
I don't know
cer-
if that's
Yeah, we certainly have and some of the works that are important are just coming out. I recently saw that Kevin Burton's book is being released. I think he's called it Apocalyptic Abolitionists.
mhm,
And what he's pointing out is that the Millerite movement and the Garrisonian abolition movement in the early 19th century of the US largely overlapped.
mm,
Meaning that if you believed that Jesus was going to return in 1843 and we're going around telling people about that, you were almost certainly also believing that not only should the slaves be freed, but that they should be given full civil rights, which was considered a radical position at the time. And you were going around telling people about that. And vice
interesting.
versa. If you believed that the slaves should be freed and given full civil rights, you likely also believed that Jesus was coming back in 1843. And William
Interesting.
Lloyd Garrison, who was the leader of that movement for abolition, it's called the Radical Abolitionists, said there's no better friend of abolition than William Miller. Okay. So I believe, and I've done some research into this as well, that if you look at apocalyptic movements in Christianity or just reform movements generally, they usually go along with some sort of vision for social reform. In other words, what makes sense of, well, just read the 95 Theses, and you will see that it mostly has to do with how the poor are being treated and how the church is fleecing them with their indulgences.
Right.
So then the story can continue from there. After the U.S. Civil War, Adventists got involved in Prohibition, which
Mhm,
was a progressive reform era movement
mhm,
driven by women and often derided, but prohibition was really not rolled back due to popular will, but the will of the elites. And drinking levels in the United States did not recover to their pre-prohibition levels until the 1990s. So it was largely a success,
mhm, mhm.
even though the political will for it among the elites at least dried up. But it's never the elites that suffer the worst consequences from vices, right? It's
That's true.
always it's always the
It's all
underclasses.
that's right. That's right.
So I consider prohibition, although there were racist elements in that movement, I consider it to have been a social justice movement.
Mhm.
And what happened after that is that Adventism had its political wings clipped by the US government. And this is another place where Kevin Burton has done some very interesting research.
What happened?
One of the most illiberal US administrations was the Wilson administration.
Mhm,
And during World War I, they brought in a censorship regime which made it illegal to publish things that were, among others, critical of the United States. And agents at the Bureau of Investigation, which would later become the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so
mhm.
basically the FBI, read our Adventist books and saw what they were saying about the United States and said, you can't be publishing this.
Really?
Yes.
So at one point, the United States was acting like a communist country?
Well, the USA has always gone through periods of more and less freedom, right? I think it's
Mhm.
going back into a period of less freedom at the moment. Yes.
So they read our books. This is the
Yes.
Bureau investigation, and
Yes.
they
Yeah, I mean,
told our leader.
if you read
That's
a book
interesting. I
like,
didn't
for
know that.
example, Percy Magan or Magan, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but you read his book, The Peril of the Republic of the United States of America. It's online for free.
Mhm,
It's down, you can download it with your Ellen White app. It comes in that bundle of the Pioneer Library or whatever. Highly critical of US imperialism, right? And
mhm,
especially the occupation of the Philippines, where incidentally was the first place where US soldiers learned how to waterboard and
mhm.
waterboarded prisoners there during the occupation of the Philippines. So yeah, they came in and said, you guys can't be publishing this stuff about the land beast of Revelation 13, right?
Wow.
And the church, and that's when the interpretation came in that the United States is not now the land beast of Revelation 13, but will be at some point in the future. Okay. Yeah, so it's I should say, let me make that more clear. When I grew up in prophecy meetings, what I was told was that there were two phases to the land beast. Okay. The first phase, it speaks like a dragon. It looks like a lamb, has a
Right.
lamb-like horns. And the second phase, it will speak like a dragon.
Dragon. That's
That
right.
will
I
that
know
will
that
that
too.
will happen in the end times. Okay. That is not what the pioneers of our church believed.
Really?
They believed that the United States had always spoken like a dragon. And they pointed to, most of all the sin of slavery as but other things as well about the United States as dragon-like speech. And for Percy Magan, that was also US imperialism, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
what came
Mm-hmm.
after the Civil War. Okay.
Right. Right.
So the two things went together. And if you read The Great Controversy very carefully, Ellen White talks about how these Puritans who came to the US for religious liberty did not extend that religious liberty to others. The Puritans
Right.
were,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they
That's
threw
true.
Roger Williams out in the middle of a snowy winter. There's in other words, this has been documented. It's not well known, obviously.
Yes, because I'm hearing about it for the first time.
Yeah.
So
So if you
yeah.
read Apocalyptic Abolitionists, or read Adventism and the Republic of the United States of America by Doug Morgan, I think it was what it's called. These lines have been traced, right? So that you come down to the time that I'm in America, in the time that I grew up, basically had what was critiqued as being the uniparty, right? That the Republicans and the Democrats were essentially the same. All right.
Right. Right. Right.
You vote for one, you vote for, it doesn't matter, right?
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
They're more or less putting the same stuff out. And that was a product of national unity brought about by the Cold War and, the post-war consensus, other things, right? And political scientists actually worked to create more of an ideological difference between the two parties
Mm-hmm.
and bring about, give people more of a choice when they voted. But what happened is, the US system really relies on cooperation to function.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many checks and balances. It's not like a parliamentary system like you have in Canada,
Right.
where the prime minister is the head of the legislature and he's the government, and within the limits set by the courts, basically what he wants goes. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And to oppose him means to throw the whole country into election, which nobody wants to do, right? And the U.S., you have to have this cooperation to get along.
Because of these different respects of governments.
And the separation of powers and so forth. When it comes to, and there's a reason why presidential democracies have almost entirely all fallen into dictatorships, right? Because, where you try to replicate the American model around the world doesn't work so well as Westminster,
Yeah.
because you need to have that sort of culture of, hey, let's get together and sort out our differences.
Mm-hmm.
And we've lost that culture in the US at the moment, right?
You can see like the because you mentioned that like earlier on about the Democrats and the Republican, there's virtually no difference between them until political scientists kind of like create the different ideological respects for both of them. But in a sense, and you could tell me what you think about this. It seems to me like there's almost a coming together in terms of their understanding, at least in part, of how Israel is operating, say in Gaza. Because there's a lot of like, what do you call that? Right now, a lot of people, even who were big supporters of Israel, they're pulling back both from the left and the right, which seems to be unifying the left and the right over this. Like, okay, this is wrong, and this is you need to step out. This need to stop, and now people who would not otherwise do it are publicly or openly criticizing Israel and the Israeli government.
Yeah, there's that going on too. But I think my bigger point is that when I was a kid, the church could basically ignore politics in the United States because it was
Mm,
carrying on. It was going to carry on. And it was mostly in line with what we as Adventists would have wanted to see, right?
hmm
Not so much anymore, right?
That's
But
right.
we have lost our political heritage as
hmm
an Adventist church, our heritage of moral social reform, right?
hmm
And it has been taken over by the partisan politics of the descendants of the Puritans, which are in the evangelical churches and the mainline churches, right?
Uh-huh.
And so now you have, Adventists is saying, hey, I got to find some way to form myself politically, spiritually now, because this is a culture war thing. This is coming back into my religious faith, right? These decisions now have implications for my religious identity in the context of this culture war that we're experiencing.
Exactly.
And they are looking for, hey, well, what are the Christian political theologies on offer? Well,
Mm-hmm.
what the ones that are on offer, leave the black church to one side because, I can't speak as much to that, obviously. That wasn't my experience in America, right? But, let's say for white people, right? And even for, I think, like Asian and Hispanic people, as I see it, around the church, right? Either you're looking to the mainline denominations and their political theologies, which, line up more with exclusive humanism, right? That we
Mm-hmm.
talked about,
Right. Right.
or you go to the other side, right? What I want to point out is that we have a different heritage as Adventists. We're not Puritan, right? We
That's
have
right.
some of that Puritan reform impulse in us,
Mm-hmm.
coming out of New England, but we care a lot more about liberty than they did, right? We also, for the Puritan right and left, the goal remains saving the United States of America,
That's right.
right? The US has to be saved in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's even a vanguard of salvation, right? Which is a sacred people, as it were, a chosen people. These Puritans saw themselves as founding a new Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those myths run deep, right? So you can look at the 16 Project as a way of anointing a new class of Israelites who are going to save America, right? It's the oppressed
Mm-hmm.
minorities, right?
Yeah.
And the Christian nationalists are fighting back against that, right? The self-avowed Christian nationalists, but the left wing is no less Christian nationalist, right? Their ideas wouldn't make sense at all without the Christian heritage from which they spring. And both of these believe that, come from this deep Puritan impulse that we're going to found this new country. It's going to be the vanguard of history, and then Jesus will come back and put his seal of approval on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Seventh-day Adventists were saying no.
Yeah.
America is not, even the Millerite Adventists were saying, no, God isn't coming back to put his seal of approval on America. He's coming back to judge America, right?
Exactly.
Because America is hypocritical, right? It is not living up to, it has all the right ideals, but it's not living up
But
to
it's not
them,
living up to it. That's true.
right? But the difference between that and other apocalyptic movements is that Adventists, instead of saying, well, we just need to hide somewhere and wait for Jesus to come back, have said, well, if America is so sinful, let Jesus not come back and find us doing nothing about it,
Mm,
right? If Jesus comes back and doesn't find us going around and getting people to sign abolition petitions, he's going to say, well, you must be okay with all this slavery. You're going
and all
into the
this
lake
wrong
of
stuff.
fire. True, right? Yeah, right. You see what I'm saying, right? But what has happened is because we had our political wings clipped by the land beast,
Mm-hmm.
we have, I think, again, you need this background to make sense of beliefs, right? So what's the experiential background that makes sense of the belief that it's a good thing that Jesus comes back and destroys the world? Well, for our pioneers, that experiential background was that, America's the last best hope of humanity. And look how that's turned out, right? By getting involved in social reform, they had an experience within which they could make sense of the second coming as a good thing. And for Adventists today, that tends to be conspiracy theories.
That's right.
Right. We have turned to conspiracy theories to make sense of that because
Mm-hmm.
we are not actually out there with any project that can bind us together as a church with social morality. And the problem that I see is if you try to take up a cause, let's say we could take up the cause of, uh, in Canada, let's bring it into the Canadian context now. Let's say we took up the cause of abortion, right? Abortion is killing unborn human beings, right? This is bad. Adventists have a very strong commitment to the sixth commandment, right? Thou shalt not kill,
Mm-hmm.
so we need to put in some reasonable restrictions here.
That's
As
right.
soon as you do that, you are coded on one side of the culture wars, right? And you exclude the Adventists on the other side, right? And the
That's
same
true.
thing, right? If we go in for, you know,
Mm.
some kind of social justice reform, well, it seems like the Black Lives Matter movement has passed, but let's say that. I mean, what could be more consonant with our Adventist history of abolition than to say Black Lives Matter? And even though slavery ended, we still bear responsibility. Ellen White makes this very clear in a pamphlet called Our Duty to the Colored People, right? But as soon as you go in that way, then you're coded on the other side of the culture war.
That's right.
And so we do find ourselves a bit stuck here as a church.
Mm-hmm.
I think, one person, when I pointed this out, said maybe we could get involved on gambling. Seems like gambling is something that both the left and the right and the
Agrees.
Adventists are concerned of, right? You know, but I think we do struggle. This is, to me, again, is the root struggles of ourselves politically. It's not that we don't have ourselves figured out in theory. All
Mm-hmm.
the history's been done, the theology's been done by our pioneers. It could all be updated, right? The challenge is, how do we don't have the kinds of experiences that can make sense of that as Adventists.
So it's almost like the polarizing of politics and stuff like that makes it very, because you're right, it makes it very difficult to assert our position in a sense. And I think it kind of goes back to what you just talked about the transcendent good. Probably that's an avenue that we should definitely explore. And because even when in the case of same-sex marriages, whether it's abortion and all these other things, is that we should look at it from the light of the transcendent good, because then it takes us out of the tug of war that is happening in the imminence. And then we're approaching that, well, we're not coming from this because the left believe it or because the right believes it, which, even in Canada here, the left and the right, I think they also influence the Canadian politics, like,
Of course. Yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot, a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but we're coming from it because this is what good is. This is what God requires.
Correct.
This is what
Correct.
this is what God says, right? This is what
Correct.
this is not what the legislation body said.
Right.
I mean, they can say what they
Yeah.
want to say, but this is what God said, and that's the handle that we're taking. Because at the end of the day, because of our theology and our understanding of end time things, we believe that God is not coming to take sides. He's coming to take over. That's actually what our theology teaches. He's the rock that cut out without a hand and became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So we have to find a way to position ourselves, and that's why I'm hinting to the transcendent good in a way that we I think it's very challenging too, because even the arguments that we say we make the arguments for the fact abortion and thou shalt not kill that you mentioned, there are Christian and people who probably classify them as Christian nationalists will probably hijack that. Yes, we're talking about the transcendent good that where it
Sure.
comes from,
Sure.
but that can also be hijacked as something that, oh yeah, but this is a right belief.
Right. Just as Black Lives Matter was hijacked from the other side of the sexual revolution.
Yeah.
So, I went to a Black Lives Matter rally because I support police reform, not police abolition, but police reform, right? And I wanted to have it out there that I don't believe that the police should be treating minorities worse than majority culture and so on and so forth. But what I heard instead were a bunch of speeches about trans people, right? I don't want trans people to be abused, but I was there to support something, and
Something else.
I heard that the
That's right.
nuclear family needs to be dismantled, and I was like, well,
What?
so why am I here, right? You know what I'm saying? So we do, nevertheless, I'll tell a couple of stories from Adventist history I think might shed light on this. One is, I think God, you're right, he's not coming back to take sides in terms of partisan politics, but for Adventist history, he's very much on the side of the poor and the oppressed. When Ellen White has her Sabbath halo vision, she sees Jesus coming back, and the slave throws off his chains, and his wicked master doesn't know what to do, right? Like, that's part of her vision of the second coming in connection with the Sabbath truth, which has to do with how do you treat your servants, right? You know what I mean? Like, this is a very central part of early Adventism. But it was also lost quite quickly as Adventists began to convert people who were not Millerites in the beginning, right? And you come down to the ordination of the first Seventh-day Adventist minister, who is African American, and he has to be ordained in a separate ceremony because the white pastors don't want to be ordained together with a black pastor, right? Wow. So already by the 1860s or whatever, like 20, 25 years later, the church's perspective on these things has shifted, and it's not progressing. It's in fact arguably regressing, right? And you have Black Adventist pastors who respond to some of this stuff by taking their churches out of the denomination, right? And what I asked myself is, why did so many stay? And I think the answer, as you put it, is the transcendent good, right? They saw that there was more to Adventism there.
I love that.
And a similar story from the other side, Ellen White, there was a convert to Adventism who was very highly placed in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the premier prohibition organization at the time. Okay. And the WCTU was women run. This was a woman, okay, and she was on their executive board, highly placed, became an Adventist. Ellen White, actually, the largest crowd she ever spoke before was at a WCTU temperance rally,
Right.
interestingly enough.
Hmm.
So,
Interesting.
yeah, when the women's now the Christian part of Women's Christian Temperance Union is very important because it turns out that these people were Christian nationalists. Okay.
Mm. Hmm.
And there was another organization called the National Reform Association, which proposed an amendment to the U.S. Constitution declaring it to be a Christian nation. It's called the Blair Amendment. And they were also proposing a bill that would declare and legally bring into effect Sunday as the national day of rest of the United States,
Hmm.
outlaw working on Sunday. This in a time when Adventists were being put in jail for doing a secular labor on Sunday as
Sunday.
a result of local laws, right?
Interesting.
So sorry?
What's a good source I could read on that? Because I've only heard about it, but I've never read about it.
Doug Morgan's book on Adventism and the American Republic, I think, is what it's talking about. Yeah, that would be the best source to begin with. But I've collected this from other places as well. I can send you more links. You can search
Okay.
this stuff up
Yes,
online.
please.
So Ellen White and Adventism is faced with a choice, right? Do we support the Women's Christian Temperance Union because they are pushing for prohibition, which we believe is very necessary, right? I mean, men are going and drinking away all their family's money and then coming home and beating their wives and their kids because they're drunk, right? Like this is a pressing issue, right?
Exactly.
Or do we pull out of the WCTU because they are trying to bring about the mark of the beast, right? The transcendent good.
And that's a big problem right there.
So Ellen White actually wrote to this lady who was like the general secretary. I don't know. She was highly placed in their organization. Recently, an article about her came out on the Adventist Encyclopedia. I wish I could remember her name, but I can send you a link to put in the show notes.
Hmm.
And she wrote to her and said, "No, the work for temperance is much more important, right? You need to stay with that organization and work for temperance reform there." So what she actually did was send Adventist views on religious liberty to everyone on their mailing list, right? Which they kind of got mad at her for, But Adventists continued to cooperate with the WCTU and eventually brought about prohibition.
Right.
So yeah, there's two sides there, right? And it seems like a lot of judgment is called for. And I think one of the challenges that we have in this regard is that we no longer have a living prophet like Ellen White who can bring some counsel from the Lord and help us
Us.
to hold these things together. And so when
Hmm.
the fundamentalist modernist controversy came along in the 90s, right after Ellen White died, and she wasn't around anymore, then Adventists did what people naturally do, is take sides, and we shipped in with the fundamentalists and began to lose some of these distinctives to our identity, like this view that the U.S. is already spoken like a dragon and these kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Just so we could gain favor and not be put in a position to discriminate against the U.S.
Yeah, yeah, that's been a problem with Adventist institutions all around the world. Same under communism and so forth, where when the government says, "Hey, we're going to shut you guys down if you don't do this," we
They
tend to find
shift.
a way to roll over, and you can overlearn that lesson of history, right? I think there were some people who overlearned that lesson during the pandemic when there wasn't as
Hmm.
much at stake as they thought there was at stake. But it is a challenge in our Adventist history, and something we need to hopefully look at with clearer eyes going forward, which is, God doesn't actually need, this is a debate, a live debate at the General Conference right now.
Hmm.
Does God need the institution of this church to go through all the way to the end? Or will it be dismantled by the persecution and we have to prepare ourselves for that eventuality, right?
That's a very good one. It's a very
Something
good.
to think about. But I think we can get a little bit too much into preserving the institution at the expense of our actual beliefs and capitulate to the point where, like in Germany, we're turning over membership roles to the Kaisers so that he can draft Adventist soldiers into the army, even though they're
Mhm,
supposed to be non-combatant. And that's
mhm,
where the Adventist Reformed Church split off. They said, no, we can't countenance that, right? And then during World War II, turning the roles over to the Nazis, right? And, that we need to think that there are dangers, in other words, to not addressing political matters to our peoples.
mhm,
But the Bible, I think, does have guidance on what God expects of the nations who are not in covenant relationship with Him, and I think that
mhm.
guidance can inform our political involvement as Adventists.
Amen. David, I feel like I could talk to you forever. And I'm sure we could have a second part to this whole thing. But thank you so much for talking to me today.
Well, it's a blessing.
Yeah, it was a wonderful conversation. And um, I would love for us to talk more a little bit about, the church moving forward, kind of a thing. That's something I could set up for our next conversation because I do think that we need more bright minds like yours to lay out and map out the way forward. Because I feel like we're in this space right now where we're trying to figure out
Yeah,
how to move,
yeah. But that's the space in which the Adventist Church first arose, right? The Adventist Church,
exactly.
apocalyptic ideas are inviting to people when they feel like their world is destabilizing and life doesn't make sense. So I think we have many opportunities as well.
Yes, yes. Many opportunities there too. I agree because sometimes something good can come from this internal struggle.
Yeah,
Like something can birth.
yeah.
And I do believe that we're at that stage to see that. But
Yeah. Praise
yeah,
God, man. Well,
yeah.
it's been a
Thank you so
pleasure
much.
to be on your show, and
Yes,
thank you for your interest. And we went long this time, but
we did.
hopefully at least one person is still with us.
Yeah, this is my longest podcast, I think,
Oh, mercy.
since I've started this show.
Okay.
We show you how much, and I know there's so much we could talk about, but I have to go because I have a meeting in a little bit. But thank you so much, and looking forward to talk to you again.
God bless you, man. We'll see you.
Yeah,
We'll see you soon.
see you soon.